So thank you all for joining us this morning. It's so great to have this amazing panel that I got to introduce. And thank you for 1 hour of free consultation to our burgeoning behavioral health movement. Yes, they were all free. As Patrick Kennedy says often, quote, "We stand on the doorstep to make momentous progress in advancing the cause of this new civil rights struggle, started by the work of President Kennedy some 50 years ago. And we're all here today because we agree that behavioral health is the next big civil rights movement." So here's what I hope we're going to achieve today. Now they're telling me I only have 37 and 43 seconds, but we're going to take a little more time. But here's what we want to achieve today. We want to get advice from these folks and learn how we're going to walk through that door that Patrick described or bust it down if we can't walk through it. We want everybody to leave this room energized and motivated and excited about what we're doing next and with concrete tools and ideas to fight stigma and discrimination, and how we're going to foster a movement that creates equity and equal rights for those with mental health and addictions, all in 40 minutes. So no small task here, a big challenge. But I'm going to start out with Mr. Black. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you for nearly 100 years of extraordinary leadership.
Thank you.
So what would you say to this group of young whippersnappers about what we need to do to build our movement based on the enormous success that you have achieved over the last 70 years?
I want to say first, I'm very honored to be asked without being intellectual or pretend to be so bright that I know everything. But when you have lived almost 97 years, you have some visual and personal experiences with the issues that might dominate. And in that period of time, I have seen and very briefly been a participant in the inequality of the distribution of health care in America. And when I was in Europe during World War II, one of the most important things, not just in the Army, but civilian life, was how do I get help when I need it? And in Chicago, where I grew up, early days, healthcare assessment and prevention and treatment was very directly the difference in race. We had no hospital that we could go to in those early days. Fortunately, it was a very aggressive people in the first movement who knew that they had to have better health care for themselves and their families. And so, under the leadership of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, Providence Hospital was developed, which was a unit of the old University of Chicago lying in. Now, in the brief time, I wonder why in the wealthiest country in the world, the distribution of something which would increase the potential is denied to so many. And the things that will cause those diseases or mental health are more in the community that's deprived than any other community.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to come back to this in just a few minutes because I think as we're making strides in the behavioral health and mental health community, we're going to talk a little bit about the ongoing inequality by class and race, even as we're making such great success. But I'm going to pivot now to Kris. Welcome to Chicago. So huge win this year, right? Really big win this year.
Really big.
Really big. Gay marriage is now just marriage in America. Just plain old marriage, right?
Great.
Despite what Kim Davis is trying to do in Kentucky, it's still marriage. So I want you to share with the audience the not-so-secret sauce to this huge victory, and especially the role that Proposition 8, of which you were the named plaintiff, how that captured the attention and changed the game.
Well, thanks for having me, and I would be remiss if I jumped right into what Proposition 8 was about if I didn't say that there wouldn't have been an effort to repeal Proposition 8 if there hadn't been decades of hard work all over the country, all over the world, to bring equality to the LGBT community. And so to come in when I did in 2008 and fight in one state, the United States, was really one point on a very big graph, one that I'm very proud of, and I think most of you are familiar with it because it wasn't just a fight in California. Almost every state in the nation had to have a fight like California did. We were fortunate to go to the Supreme Court with our bipartisan legal team. I think a big ingredient in our secret sauce ended up being bipartisan agreement on the fact that discriminating against people for who they love was not American. And that shift in leadership on the issue really drove a new conversation in the country. My wife now and I are the parents of 4 boys. So when we chose to be plaintiffs in the case, we thought, if we can do that, certainly we can be plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit. And there's that secret ingredient too. So at the same time that we had famous lawyers like Ted Olson and David Boies leading the charge for us in California, my wife Sandy and I were ordinary people plucked out of a life that was being made very difficult by this policy called Proposition 8. I'll just point out a couple of things about marriage. Even if those of you who are married out there are wondering if it's, why people are fighting so hard to be married, there is primarily the reason for it is the most important decision you make as an adult, and everybody knows it. It's your decision. Be married, don't be married to this person or not. The minute government tells you and other people you don't get to make that decision, you are not really looked at as a full-grown adult. And that level of discrimination is very, very powerful, and it's something I would like to see us not tell children anymore. So in my work as an early childhood advocate and somebody who cares deeply about human potential, I think it's important that we put policies in place that tell children they're equal and that their lives can be happy and fulfilling. So if we have policies that say you get to choose if you're married or not married, you get to serve in the United States military or you do not, those choices are under the control of the individual. I think we've done a lot to bring the feelings that everybody has into the LGBT movement, and I want to say that I think the secret sauce is ordinary people partnering with extraordinary people to bring a basic civil right to everyone.
All right.
Yeah.
I love that Kris describes herself, as she says out front, I'm not an activist. I'm just a mom of 4 boys, and I want equal rights, and I want my kids to have equal rights, and that's all we're fighting for. So I'm so glad you're not an activist, right? But speaking of activism and bipartisan political support that Senator Durbin mentioned also a few minutes ago, I turned to Marca Bristo. 1990, well, of course, today we're celebrating 25 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the enormous progress and promise that we've made. Big, big year for us, which includes people with disabilities, includes people with mental illness.
Right.
The ADA is about all of us. But to piggyback on this and the Senator's point about bipartisanship, tell us about 1990 and why that particular moment in time. How did it happen in 1990? And I'm actually curious if it could happen in 2015, but let's start in 1990.
I'll answer your last question first. No, it couldn't.
Okay.
The tension in Congress right now would not allow the Americans with Disabilities Act to go forward where it brought forward today. But let me say what was going on in 1990. First, because of Tim Black and Dr. King and Gloria Steinem and the anti-war movement, the disability community was kind of grown up in a rights-oriented society. And individual people, just everyday people, my friends Judy and Ed and Evan and Ray, all around the country, were starting to wake up and say, you know, we may have disabilities, but that's not what's trapping us. What's trapping us are society's attitudes and the barriers all around us. And there's something we can do about those if we come together. So it started with the rejection of the medical model of disability and replacing it with a social model where we see ourselves as deserving of the same rights as everyone else. And once that happened, it spread like wildfire. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. And then our movements took some really savvy lessons from others, and we started looking for members of Congress who had disability tucked away in their lives, like Senator Kennedy, Senator Harkin, Senator Dole, Lowell Weicker, Steny Hoyer. We were very savvy in finding out where they were, because if we could get through to them and get them to bring forward their own stories, it would go a long way to softening the path. But finally, someone else talked about telling the stories. One of our leaders, Justin Dart, and former Congressman Tony Coelho, asked us to dig deep into the scar tissue of our lives. Those were Tony's words. And to keep discrimination diaries. And thousands of disabled people from all over America wrote little, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, and sent them into Washington. And Justin went in before a Senate hearing and brought 3 trash bags full of these letters and said, this is what it means to be disabled in America, and you can do something to change it. So it was people power combined with some savvy, bipartisan approach to policy reform. And I'm very, very proud that we were able to do it. And finally, I want to say, like Ron Majors, I'm Marca, I'm an alcoholic and an addict, and I'm really proud of that.
Thank you so much, Marca. Yeah, the whole insider-outsider dynamic, I think, is really interesting, which is a great segue to my friend Douglas Brooks from the White House. So this is really fascinating to me. 30 years, a little more than 30 years since HIV was first reported in this country. We actually have scientists and political people and talking heads talking about the end of AIDS in America in 30 years. I'd like you to talk a little bit about, have we achieved the end of AIDS in America? But even if we have not, which I actually think we have not, what did we do inside, outside to get us to this place that we are today? And how does all of that huge success feed into what we are trying to achieve here?
Thanks for having me here. And Professor, thank you for your service, and not only in World War II, but in the Civil Rights Movement. And I am able to be here because of people like you, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Are we at the end of AIDS? I think we have, and I believe we have the tools. We have the scientific tools. We have a lot of political will. President Obama just released an updated national HIV/AIDS strategy that I think can really help us get there. Another great man at the NIH, Dr. Anthony Fauci, my colleague, really believes that if we put our efforts and our energy and our focus on getting to, and by ending AIDS, we mean a place where we have a virtual end to it. No one thinks we will never have any new infections or there won't be people living with HIV, because part of what we're striving for is to get people on medications to have long, healthy lives. And I'm not just saying this because we're here, but one of the ways, one of the things to which we have to pay great attention in order to get to the end of AIDS are the social determinants of health, including addictions and mental health, because they impact many people who are living with HIV. So that piece is important. The inside, the outside, I'm actually kind of glad Congressman has stepped out, because I won't be as embarrassed to say that I'm a lover of Kennedys. And I think I am, and for a reason. And as I was reading the purpose and the format of this gathering, it talked about the personal connections, that this isn't a staid conference, that it really is about personal connections. And for me, there's a real personal connection, and it ties into the movement that you are building. And I think the Kennedy Forum at Illinois is a huge start. And what I hope you won't do is minimize what you are doing. Because often movements start in rooms with a few people having conversations, people coming out and saying, this is not okay. And so to everyone who's come out today, welcome to the club. It gets easier as time goes on. And it is, but as a child, a black kid growing up in Georgia in the 60s and 70s, in many homes, black homes, and in churches and in funeral homes, there were these funeral home fans that had these pictures of three men, President and Attorney General Kennedy and Dr. King. And for us, those three people represented leaders in civil rights, leaders who were helping us advance our rights. As a younger adult living in Massachusetts, as a gay man who came out, as a person living with HIV, I had the terrific honor of working with Senator Ted Kennedy on issues and matters around HIV. And when Senator Durbin mentioned three men in Congress, I thought for us in HIV, our three men were Senator Kennedy, Senator Hatch, and Senator Waxman, who helped us achieve, Congressman Waxman, who helped us achieve the Ryan White program, which provides great care to people living with HIV. And then, of course, Eunice Kennedy Shriver and Disabilities, and then Congressman Patrick Kennedy and his leadership on mental health. And in each of these cases, people really connecting and revealing their personal connections to these as well. And you said earlier, ordinary people coming together with extraordinary people. And you know, the ACT UP movement that was mentioned earlier, and in many ways it was bold. I mean, you know, you had people breaking down the walls at NIH, and but it also was about people coming to the realization, coming to the place within themselves that they are children of God, that they deserve, And to the extent that we can continue to do that as it relates to mental health and addiction, and while I, you know, in the coming out spirit, I'm a social worker, and as I was in clinical social work school and reflecting and learning, I thought, oh my God, my family is riddled with anxiety and depression disorder. And you start to realize that we are all, and whether, even if it's only not only, but even if it's just going through the grieving stage, it touches each and every one of us, and therefore, we, to the extent that we're able to come together to reduce and eliminate the stigma and the shame, and organize ourselves and move forward, we'll make a difference, and you will make a difference. You are making a difference.
Thank you, Douglas. So Patrick, you actually wrote the book on stigma, or many books on stigma, it turns out. But what does coming out and insider-outsider politics and civil disobedience, what does everything that folks had to say, telling personal stories, what does this all have to do with our ability to create a robust, successful behavioral health movement?
Well, I want to congratulate you, Mark, and the Kennedy Forum for starting this out by inviting advocates from social justice in all different spheres, because you would think that this would just be focused on mental health. And you know, issues of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and major depression are issues of medical science and will impact it the better we understand it. But issues of stigma are issues of social injustice. And we learn about social injustice by learning the lessons from heroes like people on the stage and the stories they told us. 3 lessons that applies from my understanding of beating the stigma of mental illness. The first comes from the African American and the disabilities community. The African American community had Dr. King, the women's movement had Ms. Steinem, the disability movement had Justin Dart. And what we learned is while they were flashpoints for the idea, the true success was at the grassroots. So what made Dr. King successful was people like Professor Black and other folks from the grassroots, black men and women day in and day out who were living these issues and could stand up and say amen. What we learned from the gay community is the difference between the stigma of mental illness and the stigma of people of color is that stigma of mental illness is much like the LGBT community, is that you can be in the closet with it if you like. And what we know is being in the closet is hugely harmful for the well-being and health of gay men and women, but it's also bad for the community in which they live in because they can't benefit from their impact. And one of the reasons why my kids, and one of the reasons why many of your kids don't buy into the stigma of homophobia is not because in school they learn this is all biological. It's because 20, 30, 40 years ago, brave men and women like people on the stage came out. And so my kids were taught by teachers who were gay or have gay members of the family or have gay ministers and the like. So the second lesson is that we learn a lot having people with mental illness come out and share their story. And the third lesson from the HIV community is while we know HIV is a terribly disruptive, destructive illness, we also know that a narrative of pity by itself is not enough. That we do not want to just reduce the story of mental illness down to one of sadness and pity. That when you think about ACT UP in particular, these men at the time, mostly with HIV/AIDS, were powerful, demanding parity sort of things. And so similarly in walking out of here, while perhaps pity has originally brought us to this, its parity is what we seek. And the spirit of Ron Majors and Marca, my name's Pat, and I'm a person with serious mental illness, alternately diagnosed with major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and manic depression, and I'm glad to be here with you today.
Wow, really, really wonderful. So I'd like to, sort of in the spirit of ACT UP, Fight Back, I'd like to talk a little bit about the potential role of civil disobedience. Not advocating it, just saying, let's talk about it. And I'd like to start with Mr. Black and really just have people chime in on this. Because it seems to me, you know, as I was reading this week, I think, about what the University of Missouri football players did to change the story at the University of Missouri, which was not dealing with race. I think what they did was a very strategic act of civil disobedience. And it's changing the story, at least in Missouri today, in one way. So would you like to start out there?
Well, rather briefly, one of the things that we have to carry with us, should carry with us all, is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Not just all men, but all people are created equal. And the deprivation of access and treatment in the health area is so apparent that we realize that that promise is not being kept. Now, HIV, first beginning to be distributed by Caucasian men. But when we look at who is the victims and condemned the most, it happens to be usually African American men who not only feel a sense of embarrassment, but also, where do I go with this thing that I'm embarrassed by already? And so the issue for me is, opened the door for everyone and prevention so that all of us know something about how not to become ill as much as possible. But when we become to have access to a place, let me give you one example very quickly. The President's Library to be placed in Chicago on the South Side. But a trauma center desperately needed on the South Side being denied. And now, and I'll brag a little bit because I knew something. I knew the president and his wife and something about his rise to fame, maybe not glory, but fame. I was asked to be a person that talked about that to the people in that Washington group that was seeking the best place. Yeah. Now, a group of young people, black and white and other, were going to demand that no library or museum should be placed where it was going to be placed in Chicago until a trauma center. Well, the demonstration was about to begin. I had to quiet those people down to get the library. But that was how deeply young people felt about the division. Now we're going to have a trauma center, not exactly where we wanted it, but that was the thing. But it only came because there was going to be people, young people, some old people, but mostly diverse in their population, that were going to demand fairness in places where people might get traumatized and not have access.
Absolutely, a perfect example today. An example this year where civil disobedience led to the opening of a very important trauma center, insider, outsider politics, of course. Yes, Marcia.
I just wanted to say that a lot of you see lifts on buses everywhere. Those lifts wouldn't be there had it not been for the pit bull of the disability rights community called ADAPT, who all over America chained themselves to buses right here in the city. Also, the ADA would not have happened if there hadn't been the watershed moment when my good friend Bob Kafka called Senator Harkin on the phone and said, I'm going to do you a big favor for the ADA, watch the nightly news. And all the adapters pulled up to the Capitol, and about 100 of them got out of their wheelchairs and climbed up the Capitol steps. It was all over the front pages of all the major newspapers, and that was the watershed moment when Congress started to make a difference. So I believe civil disobedience is absolutely essential to social change, but it starts from people unlearning all the shame and all the stigma that they've applied to themselves. So, you know, to my colleagues who are here in recovery, it's really important that we find vehicles to find one another so that we can do that work, to come out of the closet, to be able to demand the rights that the Americans with Disabilities Act has given you. Not too many people in this part of our disability community use the law. And just last month, we were able to use the civil rights protections and some, not civil disobedience, but organizing to get Rosecrans to be able to open up a clinic in the face of the worst NIMBY prejudice that I've seen in this city in a long time. And that came because people were willing to step forward and use the civil rights tools that we have.
Great. Congratulations, Rosecrans. I think you're in the house. Very exciting. Kris, Douglas.
You know, interestingly enough, I was subjected to civil disobedience for years when I entered the courtroom with my then partner. There were groups outside every courtroom every time we went protesting our right to be married. And Kim Davis, you referenced earlier, was, in a sense, exercising her right, I guess, to disobey the law of the land. I found that it was actually quite powerful that those folks who did not agree with our position had the right to stand on the sidewalk while we walked in and get themselves on the news to say, we disagree. I had no ill will toward them. I know that sounds odd, but I really felt fortunate as a minority in America that I was able to walk into a courthouse, number one, that there was an impartial judge waiting to hear evidence, not slogans and bumper stickers, but evidence. And then when I walked out, the people who knew that was going on could protest what the possible outcome was. So it's a different way of looking at civil disobedience, sort of being on the opposite side of something that you want, but I also respected their right to do it. And I'll also make one other quick point. The LGBT community is literally a mashup of every other group. We have everybody in our group. And so every fight that's ever been fought benefits our group. And so if there are people fighting for the right to vote, there are people fighting for the right to immigrate, there are people fighting for the right for health care, women are fighting for their rights, it benefits the LGBT community because we are those people too. And so we had our own fights around specific policies in America, but we are a part of everyone else's fight too. And I think that's a really significant and a big strength of our community, actually.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know.
I think it's something that I think we're thinking about here, that it's not about some of us, but it's about all of us. And what is the connectivity here? And I think that you all sort of address that. Douglas, do you have any comments about civil disobedience?
Yeah, well, so the guy from the White House is not going to talk about civil disobedience. But I will say, and I think it just ties into what everyone has just said, whether it's civil rights, racial civil rights, or it's LGBT rights, or HIV rights, or mental health rights, what we should all be advancing and promoting are human rights. That's the connection of this, is that we are all human beings, and we should be advancing those rights.
Good.
I agree. That's right. So, Pat, I wanted to ask you, sort of as a follow-up to the reference to the courts, though this is not your expertise. There's been a lot of court cases. I mean, there were very famous mental health court cases, Olmstead and beyond. But what do you think is the potential role of the court in mental health parity, for example? I know we're celebrating parity, and it says it's the law of the land, but are there things that we should learn from other courts?
I think it's important to remember that, again, this is an issue of social justice, and just as other communities have done very well in the courts, some of these battles need to be worked out in the courts too. There can be some aspect of redress that way. But also there are things there already, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and instead of just limiting it to court battles, we also should think about how we can work with employers. Thresholds, amongst other groups, has an exemplary experience in that regard, because employers don't necessarily want to exclude people with serious mental illness. They just want to know how they can help those people meet their vocational goals, like job coaches and the like. So the courts can be very beneficial, but there's also this issue of implementing existing law into the community so they can be taken advantage of. And I just might say about civil disobedience.
Please.
I mean, what a great conference. Here we are at a staid conference about medicine, and you come in here with all this uppity stuff about civil disobedience. And we have wonderful examples in our history. I mean, I still am moved by the Selma movie with Dr. King and folks coming over the bridge. You kind of wonder, you know, there are really smart, organized LGBTQ people have done this, and really smart and organized women have done this, and people of color, but how about those mentally ill people? I mean, how can they do that? They're so disorganized and psychotic and the like. And we need to realize that is at the heart what stigma is because not only can they do it, they are doing it. And one of the best examples in my life is I've been a licensed clinical psychologist for 25 years, and I learned when I got out of school that schizophrenia was the kiss of death diagnosis, and you might as well give up. And it's fundamentally people with lived experience who brought this recovery thing on us and taught it to us. And in the new Freedom Commission, and a new Freedom Commission of other places, it was advocates of lived experience who made that the law of the land and sort of the guiding principle. And so already there's civil disobedience, there's active efforts to change the agenda and doing well.
That's right. Marca?
Yeah, I wanted to say that my organization was one of the organizations that brought the Olmstead cases. For those of you that don't know, this is an Americans with Disabilities Supreme Court decision that required states to allow people to live in the community under the most integrated setting mandate of the ADA. And we filed 3 cases in order to be cross-disability, and the state has been under 3 consent decrees, thresholds as a partner with Access Living in helping to get people out of institutions. For those of you who care about the deinstitutionalization with supports and services, now is the time to organize. Those consent decrees are starting to come to the possible end, but the work can't stop. And the pressure has to stay on the governor and on the legislature to keep the budget supported so that the thousands of people who in Illinois today still live in institutions can eventually get out. And that comes from people power. And that's why I'm so excited about this session today, because I really think a little bit of organizing goes a long way for social change.
Absolutely. So my clock here says 1:41. I don't know where the time went. I think somebody stole some of my time, but I'm going to respect this clock. And just very quickly, I'm sorry we don't have time for questions. I'm sure there's so many amazing questions here. But I'm just going to ask the folks to just go one by one and tell this group what is one thing that will make a huge success in our creation, sustainability of a behavioral health movement that will change the game like it has changed the game for everybody that we care about up here.
Well, very quickly, and I don't claim to be, I think that education in the public schools and in the private schools would help in the early stages of not only helping prevention, but participation in activity for those who are affected by these illnesses, mental or physical or whatever, as they, and I don't know the figures, but I suspect that keeping a person well is much cheaper than after they become ill and dependent on others for survival or even activity.
Awesome.
That's the economics I think would play into the, but helping educators to early on to understand that in the prevention of mental, or if the possibility, there creates a base for the young person to go on to life in a more productive, happy way.
Fantastic. So education and early intervention, I'm hearing. Douglas.
As I look out at the beautiful, beautiful faces that I see, one that I see is Dr. David Satcher, who I think is speaking later, and Dr. Satcher has spent his career working on racial and ethnic disparities, which also exist in mental health. I would say bring in more people of color and more black people, more brown people to the movement, both to help them understand the role they have to play and to strengthen the movement as well.
Fantastic. Kris.
Vote.
Vote. Okay.
Vote for people who will protect the most vulnerable in our society and lead us to a better, more inclusive country.
Awesome. Fantastic. Marca, and then we're going to end with Patrick.
Employment, giving people the ability to take advantage of reasonable accommodations in the workplace and be able to have an economic life, employment.
Fantastic. And Pat.
We want to empower the community that is affected most by stigma and replace it with ideas of recovery and self-determination.
There you go. So folks, I cannot thank you enough. As I said in my introduction, there are many friends on this dais with me. There are many heroes. You literally have changed America. You have changed the world. You have made life so much better for millions and millions of people. And we are so thrilled and honored to be with you and to take these lessons. And we may be the new civil rights struggle, and we are going to be successful. When we convene in a couple more, we're going to convene next year and the next year, but we are going to be successful, and we're going to take these lessons, the big brains and the big hearts that you have, and make sure that it just spreads like wildfire in our community. So I am so grateful. Please give it up for this enormously great crowd. Thank you.